students. Our next poem for discussion is Spring and Fall by G.M. Hopkins. G.M. Hopkins was born on July 28, 1844. He was an English poet, one of the most individual of the Victorian writers. His works were not published in collected form until 1988, but he has a great influence on many leading 20th century poets. He was the eldest of nine children who had been to British Consul General in Hawaii and himself published verses. Hopkins also won the poetry prizes during his school time and was awarded a grant to study at Oxford, where he continued writing poetry while studying the classics. And in that atmosphere of Oxford movement, which renewed interest in relationships, he was received into the Roman Catholic Church. He left Oxford with a distinguished academic record and he decided to become a priest. And for this, he entered the Jewish novitiate and burnt his youth verses, determined to write no more. And until 75, he kept a journal recording as his vivid response to nature as well as his expression of philosophy. His philosophy emphasized the individuality of every natural thing, which according to Hopkins was inscape. We have discussed these two concepts, inscape and instressed, in our earlier sessions as part of literary terms which have been prescribed in our syllabus. We repeat that he emphasized the individuality of every natural thing, which according to Hopkins was called inscape, because according to him, each sensuous impression had its own elusive selfless. Each scene was to him a sweet, special scene. When he went to Buenos College in North Wales, he studied theology and he also learned Welsh. And under the impact of this language and poetry, he began to write poetry again. He wrote a long poem, The Wreck of the Deuchlen, in which he succeeded realizing that there is an echo of a new rhythm that has been long haunting his ears, but it was rejected. He also wrote a series of sonnets which were strikingly very original in their richness of language and use of rhythm. One of the remarkable sonnets is The Windhover, which has been frequently analyzed poems in English literature. And he continued to write poetry, but only read his manuscripts by his friends and fellow poets. He was appreciated because of the strangeness of his poems, but still his poems were encouraging. He was ordained to the priesthood in 1877 and he served as a missioner and an occasional preacher and a parish priest. He was also appointed professor of Greek literature in University College Dublin. But Hopkins was not happy in Ireland because he found the environment uncongenial and he was overworked and poor health. Then he wrote again another series of sonnets. The first sonnet was Carrion Comfort. This was also a beautiful sonnet praised by critics. These poems or terrible sonnets, they reveal a tension between the delight of the sensuous world and his urge to express this delight, and also an equally powerful sense of religious vocation. When he was in Dublin, Hopkins developed another of his talents, that was musical composition. The little he composed shows some daring originality, as does his poetry. His friends constantly urged him to publish poems, but Hopkins always resisted. That he saw in print his lifetime was some very immature verses and original Latin poems. And he died of typhoid fever and was buried in Dublin. Among his unfinished work was a commentary on the spiritual exercises of Saint Ignatius of Loyola, who was the founder of Jewish order. Coming to the poem Spring and Fall, which has been addressed to a young child, he begins the poem by addressing Margaret. Margaret, are you grieving over Golden Grove unleaving? Leaves like the things of man you, with your fresh thoughts care for, can you? Ah, as the heart grows older, it will come to such sights colder. By and by, nor spare a sigh. The words of vanhood leave me lie, and yet you will weep and know why. Now, no matter, child, the name. Sorrow springs are the same. Nor mouth had, no nor mind, expressed what heart heard of ghost guests. It is the blight man was born for, it is Margaret you mourn for. This poem, Spring and Fall, presents a young girl's apparently frivolous grief, and Hopkins quickly clarifies that the child's mourning seeming frivolity actually is much more serious than he initially suggests. The words spring and fall, they are used for changing of seasons and also a comment upon the humanity's predisposition for sadness, sin and untimely death. In the poem, he also begs the question of people's response to discovering their inherent death. And he suggests that all individuals grieve for themselves and their fate. Margaret, the little girl, she functions as the stand-in for every person who in childhood came to realizations that seasons are transient. This fact we need to understand. And Hopkins uses the idea of seasonal shift of leaves falling from the trees, destroyed ideal of Golden Grove unleaving to suggest time's inevitability. The loss of constancy and childhood innocence, which is suggested by the realization that time brings about change, implies maturity which comes with the understanding or the original sin. Now the poem's rhythm, when we talk of the rhythm and phrasing, they are very reminiscent of a nursery rhyme because the rhyme scheme results in a paradoxically soothing context. He sets up the end of the poem as a moral lesson, except that the moral lesson learned would not be anticipated from the poem's beginning because he begins the poem by asking Margaret, Margaret, are you grieving? When he says that, are you grieving, he necessarily does not suggest that Margaret should stop grieving. Instead, he invokes the idea of the blight man was born for. Now, this is the reference to the original sin. The story of the Garden of Eden, the story of Adam and Eve, blight man was born for. Man was cursed to live such a kind of a life which is transient on this earth. Thus, Margaret, a little girl here, she is representing every man or perhaps every child who is on the brink of realizing the blight of human condition. Because time causes change, and with the passage of time it brings loss and death, which is inevitable, which waits at the end of everybody's life. And Hopkins provides the moral that all humanity, they are mourning itself, for all humanity is equally ill-fated and will die. So it's not just the question of leaves falling from the trees, it's a question of man dying a death because man is mortal and we cannot live forever. Now, coming to the poem line by line, we are taking up the first 4 lines first. Hopkins says that with your fresh thoughts you care for, can you? In this line, Hopkins derives the basic factor of the poem's setting. Now, Margaret is noted as a young person and the narrator references her contemplations as fresh thoughts. They are fresh thoughts, pure thoughts, young thoughts, saddened by a golden grove where the leaves are falling from their trees to signal their end. And this is the information which is presented within this bit of description because the reader actually overlooks some of the more significant details. And specifically, Margaret, who is being treated as an aspect of nature herself because her ideas are referred to as fresh, which again is a description that fitting when detailing, for instance, an apple. The fruit is fresh because age has yet to take the vigor and similarity of wording parallels with Margaret's youth with nature's bounty. And further, the notion of grieving over a golden grove. This grove means a series of trees because the idea that they are golden. This golden color links the setting to autumn color showcasing themselves on the leaves. Now, these details are very important in understanding the scene itself because the reader can envision a collection of autumn colored trees. They can imagine autumn colored trees before the young girl as she is weeping. And they are significant as well as to the meaning of spring and fall. The reader quickly grasps the idea that young girls grieving for trees losing their luster and changing the seasons refers to the concept of mortality. And this mortality in this poem is centered as the focal point to the poem's overall concept. In the next 4 lines, the poet or the narrator, he assures the young girl that heart will age and mature until she is colder towards sighs of natural demise. So much that she will not spare a sigh for them once she is older. Now, this information given after a quick for a transitional element from her current grief to her future lack of mourning is a simple addition to the poem because it provides a wistful quality to the concept. The poet fondly talks of Margaret's youthful ideas, but ultimately knows that these ideas will not survive until her adulthood. And because they will not survive, the answer to the question is a speculation because when we describe a van would leave me lie, which is a very cumbersome way to say that there is a collection of, say, dead leaves cluttered together, the readers easily conclude that the poet is being coinciding by flashing his knowledge of a deeper, mature concept that the child cannot grasp. Now, there is also promise in these lines that even though nature in autumn's grip will not spark towards Margaret's mourning because as she ages, she will not weep and know why, but essentially, he assures the child that her emotions will linger. Now, logically, they would need to be directed at something else if nature will no longer be the cause. And one day, Margaret will definitely discover the reason behind her emotions because something that the child would arguably not understand at this point of or age in her life. Now, in these lines, something worth noting is that the rhyme scheme, the lines before and following the rhyme scheme, that is A, A, B, B, C, C, there is a trio of lines here. And they are rhyming specifically when we see at line 7, 8, and 9, which ends with a sigh and lie and why. Already there is a section which has been noted as a transitional territory because the narrator is giving a commentary on the future of the focus of the child. And this alteration of the rhyme scheme, this solidifies that variation. And this is a very important change because this distinctive change that the girl will undergo once she understands why she is weeping during her old age. Next 4 lines, the reader learns that the principal reason for Margaret's mourning has nothing to do with autumn plants or the field of trees. Rather, it is Margaret she mourns for. Essentially, the child cannot understand the reason for her despair because the troubling aspect that sparks her tears is that one day she will also die. and she mourns her own mortality. Now, this is very pathetic and interesting, because if we are crying for someone's loss, and ultimately we are told and we realize that we are crying on our own death, this is where we realize that we are mourning on our own mortality. And in time, Margaret also knows this in details, because she grieves in the simple manner or having her heart being touched by the dying of the leaves. Now, this is not something that Margaret should feel weak over, because as the narrator explains that this is the blight man was born for, because it is referred to as the original scene. Man was cursed and born for this blight, that is mortality. Now, this creates or lends a universality to the concept of death and life, because everyone is destined to leave life behind, and having fear, dread, or griefs over the idea is very rational and real, because even before a person is old enough to fully understand that the prospect enough to differentiate, why is she mourning for? Now, if we look at the poem in its togetherness, it is just a commentary on the fear and dread of death, which is very integral to the life, because young Margaret, she does not grasp that she has any kind of thought of her own mortality. And according to the poet, or according to Hopkins, she will not have that understanding until later in life. Still, there is a heaviness in regard to mortality, which props up or surfaces in detail, which she is unable to grasp at this moment when she looks at the leaves which are dying during the autumn or the fall. She recognizes mortality, and one day she will realize that her hesitance towards it is connected to her own end. Even though she does not yet know that there is a fear or a dread, this fear is being highlighted, and this concern of mortality haunts all humans throughout the life.